This podcast is brought to you by North Carolina's electric cooperatives.
This is NC Spin, an unrehearsed discussion on issues of interest to North Carolinians. Now, here is your moderator, Tom Campbell.
Thank you for tuning in this week's NC Spin. North Carolina is a state under siege from many different directions, and we begin with the big story for the week, the threats of President Trump to move the Republican National Convention out of North Carolina. We'll examine the protests, riots, and looting taking place in our communities, and we'll ask if officials are handling the situation well. And COVID-19 still with us, so we catch up on where things stand in week 2 of Phase 2 reopening. Plus, we're going to ask the panel to tell us something we don't know. Speaking of which, our panel this week includes former House Speaker Joe Mavretic, Chris Fitzsimon, director of the state's Newsroom, John Hood, syndicated columnist and author, and Cash Michaels, a journalist and filmmaker. We'll begin our uninterrupted discussion after these brief messages from our underwriters.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
I want to thank Brad Crone for sitting in for me last week. It was a good show and fun to watch. Now, let's begin the spin. For some weeks, the Republican National Convention Committee and state leaders have discussed how to slate the August nominating convention safely during the pandemic. Just before Memorial Day, President Trump said he might move the convention to another city because he says Governor Roy Cooper didn't want to cooperate. Discussions were going back and forth until this past week, when it became obvious Trump insisted that 19,000 people be allowed into the Spectrum Arena and resisted any attempts to make it smaller. And on Tuesday night, he said he was moving the event to another city. Joe Mavretic, is this a done deal? The governor said never to trust Trump tweets. And I understand there's still discussions going on. What do you think? Is the convention moving?
I don't think anybody knows yet, but there's something in this one for everybody. First of all, there's the contract between the city and the RNC. Then there's a whole lot of money, and nobody knows exactly how much, somewhere between $100 million and maybe $200 million. Then this is a purple state. We have to be concerned about whether or not Trump's going to get a bump from wherever he goes. Then you have the President of the United States in a fight with a Democratic governor of North Carolina. And so I don't think anybody knows how it's going to end, number one. I don't know what the end game is, who wins, who loses, and what they win or lose. I don't think anybody's going to know anything, but North Carolina's a state where we really pay a lot of attention to contracts. And I think the contract between the city of Charlotte and RNC is a significant issue in this. You also have to remember that the Charlotte City Council had a couple of members who didn't want it in the first place. And Governor is basing his resistance on the virus, and Trump's coming down on money in the bump.
Well, Cash, Governor Cooper keeps saying he wants the Republican National Convention to be held in Charlotte, but he asked for a scaled-down event, and Trump basically said, take it or leave it. We either want 19,000 people in the arena, we're not going to do any social distancing, we're not going to do any face masks, take it or leave it. What do you think? Who's being unreasonable?
God bless Governor Cooper. He's trying his best not to put a partisan face on all of this. He's trying to govern in the interest of public health. It's kind of hard to do when you have the President of the United States calling you out on Twitter, on television, every place else. I'll be frank with you, and I think Joe did an excellent job of mapping out the confusion. I'm as confused as anybody else. I agree with Joe that contracts will probably rule the day. But ultimately, we're hearing that a piece of the convention may be in this state. Something else may happen in another part of the country. I'll be frank with you, I'm confused. I couldn't answer your question if I put money on it.
Well, don't do that. Let's look at the data, Chris. For the past week, we have had the highest number of new cases reported in coronavirus in North Carolina. And a lot of people are saying this is due to the fact that we've reopened the state. Yes, we're doing more testing, but that this backs up Governor Cooper's demand that we need to have caution here. What do you say?
Well, I think we're always going to have more cases when we do more testing, but we're at a plateau, but a high plateau in the number of hospitalizations. What I find astonishing is that the Cooper administration was in good faith negotiations with the RNC. RNC officials said that, and they were all, both sides, blindsided by Trump's tweets, trying to make political points. And now this has literally become a battle, somehow a partisan battle between the Trump administration and Governor Cooper. I think it's a little unreasonable for anybody to say, can you guarantee us that we can have 19,000 people crowded into an arena side by side with no masks in late August, when we have no idea what's going to be happening with the virus in late August? One of the cities that's been mentioned to move the convention to is Nashville. This week, the mayor of Nashville said it's not safe to have that many people inside an arena in Nashville.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a lot of things happening here. I think President Trump is desperate to get any sort of political bump and get his base excited because he's falling in the polls. Governor Cooper is trying, I think, to balance public health. I take him at his word, and the economic impact of this and the contracts. As Cash says, it's very confusing. It's hard to know how to answer this.
John, the legislature in the last couple of days has introduced a bill which would force, it says, Governor Cooper to house the Republican National Convention without restrictions. Can they do this? And if they do, will Cooper veto it?
Of course they can do it. Of course he will veto it.
That's the shortest answer you ever gave me in 21 and a half years.
I agree with everyone else that there's a lot of smoke and fog here, but I think I can see through it. And I think what we're going to see is some kind of convention business done in Charlotte in an attempt to satisfy the contracts and the original expectations. And then I think the big sort of coronation event will occur in an outside venue in some other state. Remember, we've seen that before. We saw that. Now, it wasn't a different city, but we've seen the Democratic National Convention when President Obama was nominated. The actual event where he made the big speech was in a big arena, different from where the business of the convention was done. I think you'll see something like that here, perhaps in Jacksonville or Nashville or some other place. You'll have a big, I think, outside event where Trump will formally accept the nomination. I want
to go around the horn here and ask each of you in about 20 seconds, who's winning and who's losing here politically? By the way, Civitas and PPP both released polls this week showing that 63% of the people in North Carolina approve of Governor Cooper's handling all of this. So I think that probably gives him a little backbone. Who's winning and who's losing, Joe?
Well, I don't think you can. I'm not going to do that. I just want everybody to realize that 19,000 people are less than the crowd at a Duke Carolina game in the Dean Dome.
All right, Chris.
Well, nobody's proposing we have a Duke Carolina game where people sit beside each other with no masks on. I would say that we, right now, I think it depends on which side of the fence. Are you red? Are you blue? Trump's trying to score points. Cooper's trying to work, I think, largely behind the scenes, which is why this is so frustrating.
Cash, who's winning and who's losing?
I think Governor Cooper is winning. He has more credibility than the President of the United States, and I think that 64% of North Carolinians who back the governor on this.
John, who's winning and losing?
It's a wash. Most people, I think, I will hate to break it to all the politicos in the room, including me, but most people don't pay much attention to this sort of stuff. So I think Democrats like what Cooper's doing, Republicans like what Trump is doing. But I'll tell you one area where there is tremendous anger and disappointment, and that's in the Charlotte business community.
Yeah.
And that's not a partisan thing. They're already been hit hard by the coronavirus and the aftermath, and they just see business disappearing. They're angry about it.
I think you're probably correct with that. Let's move on. Protests, riots, and looting. Well, following the violent death of George Floyd, protests erupted throughout our state and in the communities across the country. Last Saturday and Sunday nights, there was violence and looting occurred in some communities, but curfews have been established in many of our municipalities, and in recent nights, they've had peaceful protests. Cash Michaels, there have been criticisms leveled at some mayors and police chiefs from those who said they didn't respond quickly enough, appropriately enough. At the same time, there are those who are saying the police were too forceful in dealing with the crowds. What's your view of how our state and local leaders have responded to these protests?
I think the response is based on the culture of the police agency involved and then vis-a-vis the culture of the government that runs that police agency. For instance, in Fayetteville, you had a police department there that really did not want to forcefully engage with the community. They wanted to actually work with the community, and they ended up being the first, if I'm not mistaken, in the state during this whole crisis to actually kneel in reverence with the crowd. Here in Raleigh, you had police officers who really didn't know what to do because all hell was breaking out. Our state police, they did their best to protect the governor's mansion, and they did such a good job with no violence, no incidents, that the governor himself actually came out of the mansion and marched with some of the protesters. So it has a lot to do with the culture of the police agency as to how they handled the situation.
Joe, there's been some criticism, particularly in Raleigh, when the police turned out in riot gear. They're saying this really wasn't called for. It was too heavy-handed a response. What do you say? You're an old military man. What do you say?
Well, my military mind tells me that there was command and control of the beginning and the end. I think that when you look at who was leading with the bullhorns, I think there was communications between them. I suspect that behind the scenes there's a lot of wiretapping. I think behind the scenes there's a lot of people who are doing facial recognition to find out who was the leaders, particularly the first night with all the destruction downtown. But I want to say one thing about leadership. If you think about North Carolina, the crime control and public safety and crime control secretary is an African American appointed by a liberal white Democratic governor. The head of the Supreme Court in North Carolina is a black attorney, the Chief Justice. The head of the Highway Patrol in North Carolina, that colonel is African American. The sheriff in Wake County is African American, and so is the chief of police. So if you want justice and you want changes, then in North Carolina you can go to the top and expect those changes.
John, Governor Cooper has been under a lot of fire because, in fact, one reporter actually said he was pandering to these crowds because he wouldn't allow crowds of more than 25 people to gather throughout the state because of Phase 2, and yet he was allowing them to march. Governor Cooper, in response, said, wait a minute. I allowed the reopened protesters to march because it was their First Amendment right. Is he justified in this response?
He would be justified if he had initially not attempted to stop the reopened protests. So he's correct that the protests are being treated the same. That was not the administration's initial response. You recall also to religious services. They made some significant errors early. Of course they have to allow protests to occur. And they did. I think that things got out of control in the first night or two, depending upon the community you look at. But once the police and the local officials understood the gravity of the situation, that the vast majority of peaceful protests were being used as a shield by some who wanted to engage in violence. Once they figured that out and acted more appropriately, things calmed down a bit. But it is a difficult call. Different communities did it different ways. Cash mentioned Fayetteville, which is a good example. The police approached the situation differently, but also Fayetteville was, I think, the first to have a curfew and had tremendous damage and violence in the initial night in Fayetteville. So it is a very difficult issue where people are trying to balance a lot of different situations. In Raleigh, the allegation was the police showed up in riot gear and provoked folks to get more raucous. But of course, that first night, folks attacked the public safety building where the jail is and tried to get inside. And thank goodness the police were ready to handle that with appropriate equipment. So
and many of the protesters are saying these are outside agitators that are causing this.
Yeah, I mean, we hear the outside agitator thing for 70 years. That doesn't mean it's always wrong. In this case, it's not really outside agitators, because most of the small minority who are violent are actually locals.
Well,
but they have radical views. They're not
Yeah.
the same as people who are just expressing concern about George Floyd. It's not the same group.
Chris, we've been here before. We've seen excessive force by the police, military, whatever. This time, to me, feels a little bit different. Would you agree with that or disagree with that?
I definitely agree with that, and I think that I agree with almost everything that people have just said. I do think Cash is onto something. The culture of the police force, the culture of the response, how they responded after especially that initial night or two, as John was mentioning. I think when we stop and look back in this in a few years, this is a turning point for America. Think about the last time there were several hundred people in Marion, North Carolina, in Lenoir, North Carolina. There's something happening here. The majority of Americans in polls sympathize with the protesters. I think the majority of people are troubled when there's violence. I do think that's a small number of protesters, but we really are at a crossroads, an inflection point, whatever you want to call it. And I think that it's a stunning thing to watch who is protesting, mostly how they're protesting, and what is happening here. And I think our political leaders are wise to listen and listen and listen to these people and not condemn them out of hand.
Key word, listen. Cash, final word on this particular topic. We have had lots of examples where police officers have been kneeling in solidarity with the protesters. How much longer do you think this is going to go on?
I hope it goes on to the point where people actually sit down and start talking, and as my colleague Chris says, starts listening. I will say this, though. Right now, things seem to have calmed down. It'll be probably a year before we get to a trial of those 4 police officers who are accused in the murder of George Floyd. And I guarantee you, if the right decision does not come down from that trial, you're going to see what you saw this week 10 times.
Another area in which the state is under siege is the COVID-19 pandemic. While the conventions and protests grabbed most of the headlines this past week, we're reminded that coronavirus is still here. In fact, we've recorded record high numbers of cases in the past weeks and record numbers of hospitalizations. There are also record numbers of people being tested. Some 450,000 North Carolinians have been. Chris, our legislature passed a bill that would require Governor Cooper to reopen bars and allow increased outdoor seating for restaurants. Cooper says we aren't ready to take that step yet. He hasn't vetoed this bill yet. He's got to the end of the weekend. Is he going to veto it, and can the legislature override it?
I think he's likely to veto it, although there were indications late this week that he was considering some modification of that, which I trust the governor and the state health professionals. I think they've done overall a good job managing this crisis. I think some of the legislature's intent is legitimate and economic. I think some of the legislators' intent is partisan and trying to make points with their base and say that they're somehow trying to get people back to work and as an attack on the governor. I think we're going to see more phased reopening, but I will tell you that we also have to keep an eye on the public health aspect of all this. If hospitalizations go up, that we're not out of the woods yet by any means, and it's very complicated, and we have to trust the professionals and balance, as we say every week, the health risks versus the economic problems.
Joe, the legislature this past week introduced a bill which would require the governor to open up the gyms also, and I don't know, but I would suspect it would get the same kind of treatment should it pass both houses of the legislature as the bar bill. What do you think?
I don't know about that, Tom. I think that the gyms and the bars should have been included with some of the other agencies that are allowed to open at reduced rates. I just think it was a bad idea to put them in a class by themselves, and I would hope that ends in a hurry.
Yeah, so far as it goes, this does seem to be somewhat partisan at work here.
It depends on which chamber you look at. Actually, the state Senate, some of these proposals have passed with not unanimous, but very high levels of support. The House has been more partisan in the divide.
Yeah, and so far as it goes, Cash, the governor indicated in his press conference on Thursday there might be a phase 2.5. Does that mean he is bending to the pressure or what?
I think Governor Cooper is listening to Dr. Mandy Cohen, the Secretary of DHHS. I hope I got all those letters. And he's listening to the science. And if science can give him some wiggle room, then he'll take it. But I think he's working responsibly to make sure that more people are not infected. And I understand that business is suffering now. Wait till the second wave comes and we'll see a lot of these places having to close down again because folks took for granted that the crisis was over.
It's worth pointing out, Tom, I just want to jump in. It's worth pointing out if you look at other states, Governor Ron DeSantis, a close ally of President Trump, has been an early reopener. He reopened the bars in Florida, but said you can't reopen the bars in Miami. There are Republican governors across the country. There are Democrat. This is not North Carolina is not the only state in the epidemic. Cooper's not the only governor of either party who's making these tough calls.
And
this is true, but it is also true that North Carolina's restrictions are much higher than any other state in the Southeast.
Yeah.
It's not even close.
We're forgetting about the fact that the legislature is in session right now. And, John, we're not hearing a whole lot about them. We know their principal task in the short session is to craft a budget. One of your colleagues wrote a piece in Carolina Journal this past week saying that the key word in this week's legislative session is no. Explain what that means and tell us if you agree with it.
Well, what we have is billions of dollars of projected deficits, mostly because of revenue shortfalls. Usually we go into a recessionary period and we have a budget deficit. It's a combination of higher service demands on the one end and lower revenues on the other. Right now we're looking primarily just at the lower revenue side. And what legislators are saying and others are saying who are watching this process closely is not only should you not expect very much in the way of new expenditure, but oddly, the administration, and of course they're distracted, the Cooper administration has a lot of other things to do, but in previous crises like that, other Democratic and Republican governors would have taken earlier steps to control spending. Governor Cooper hasn't done that yet, but he will, and so he will also be saying no.
Yeah, Joe, you've been through a lot of these in your service in the legislature through the years. Are you hearing any word about personnel cuts, pay cuts, reductions in force, anything like that coming out of the legislature?
I haven't heard anything coming out of the legislature, but I'll tell you the rumor that I've heard, and I put some credibility in it, is that the private sector has taken a hit with the virus, the public sector has not, and that perhaps we ought to be asking, should we have some cuts?
Share the pain?
Share the pain, and start the sharing above $50,000 to take it to about 65 and have about a 5% cut there. From 65 to about 80, have about a 7.5% cut there, and above 80,000, have a 10% cut there. And I don't think that would be unwelcomed across the board.
You've either started a movement or else this is...
there are a lot of people who have talked about the public sector, which is primarily a personnel sector, not sharing some of the blame, and I think that's a good point.
All right, we got about 2.5 minutes left in show. We want to get the panel to tell us something we don't know. Chris Fitzsimon, start us off.
Well, I referred to it. I think we all know it, but I think we're underestimating it. I think there was a national turning point when President Trump ordered, or the Justice Department cleared peaceful protesters with tear gas for a photo op with the Bible, and then a 4-star Marine general condemned that. This is a moment in history. We can't go through the show without talking about the lack of leadership in Washington, which is one of the gravest crises we face in America.
I think we just did. Cash Michaels, tell us something we don't know.
I'm going to repeat what I just said earlier, that if you think this week was bad news for America, you let a jury in Minnesota not convict those 4 officers for the murder of George Floyd, and you've seen nothing yet.
Oh, my goodness. John Hood, tell us something we don't know.
There's been a lot of concern that even though the University of North Carolina and other colleges and universities are opening in the fall for in-person classes, that students won't show up. That's not what the initial evidence suggests. It suggests that that students are coming in large numbers. It is primarily colleges that are relying on a lot of out-of-state students that may have enrollment problems, it looks like. So if you're in a UNC school that's mostly, overwhelmingly in-state, it looks like there isn't going to be a whole lot of drop-off of enrollments.
Yeah, Joe Mavretic, tell us something we don't know.
The coronavirus has eliminated handshakes, fist bumping, elbow bumping, hip bumping, and so I propose that we start going with the Carolina clasp, coming and going. Good to see you. How you doing? And Goodbye. Come back again.
You're a trendsetter this week. So far as it goes, the education leaders in our state, public education, and the health leaders in our state are supposed to announce next week what parameters are going to be in place for us to open our public schools beginning on August 17th. Well, you've heard our spin on the issues of the day. To stay informed all during the week, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter, give your feedback, and read my weekly column. Visit our website, ncspin.com, or catch NC Spin on Facebook. And while on the website, subscribe to our free weekly newsletter, our podcast. And in the meantime, we want you next week to stay informed and watch out for the spin.
Today's tools make you a real DIYer, and as a member of an electric cooperative, you have lots of valuable tools to help you do it yourself in controlling your home energy use and budget, leaving you free to be Dad.
The big issue in 2020 is healthcare. Let's talk basics. You are the key to your own personal health, but there is strong evidence that if you have a relationship with a family physician, your quality of life will be better. You'll likely live longer, and you'll have 33% lower healthcare costs. Your family doctor knows you, has your medical history, and can quickly diagnose health problems. Family Physicians, your trusted healthcare advisor for life.
North Carolina Channel is made possible by the financial contributions of viewers like you who support the UNC TV network.